CHAPTER XIV Part II of History of the Christian Church during the First Six Centuries. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Christian Church during the First Six Centuries by S. Cheetham. Chapter XIV Growth of the Church, Part II. But the conquests of the Church in the East and South are insignificant in their effect upon the history of the world compared with the conversion of the Teutonic tribes. In them was found a fresh and unexhausted stock on which the engrafted Word grew and flourished in new life and vigor. The deities of the Teutons were for the most part, like those of the Greeks and Romans, personifications of the powers of nature. The classical writers had, indeed, no hesitation in identifying these divinities with their own. But there was in the Teutonic mythology nothing of the lightness and frivolity which often appears in the classical. It was grave and solemn, sometimes cruel; and if we may trust the account of Tacitus, that the Germans shrank from any attempt to enclose heavenly beings within the walls of temples, or to give them the semblance of humanity, they were not altogether unprepared to worship him who is invisible. A very marked trait of the Teutonic character was the strong feeling of loyalty which bound every Teuton to his chief. The fealty which they gave to an earthly lord they gave to their heavenly Lord and Master when he was made known to them. His battles they were ready to fight. The love of freedom, the sense of personal dignity, which had been almost lost in the empire through the all-absorbing claims of a despotic state, were still in full activity among the Germans. Among such a people the gospel which taught the preciousness of individual souls was likely to find an easy reception. The respect paid by the Teutons to their women also no doubt conduced to the spread of Christianity. It is remarkable in how many cases Christian princesses bent the hearts of their husbands to the cause of Christ. There were, however, great differences in the religious condition of the various peoples. Among the more remote tribes which came little in contact with foreign influence, as the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Danes, paganism was, in the period of which we are now speaking, very vigorous and rooted in the affections of the people. But in the settlements within, or on the borders of, the empire, the superior spiritual and intellectual force of Christianity made itself felt. Even where the Christians were conquered, they overcame their vanquishers by the arts of peace, as the Greek had once overcome the Roman. It is probable that the race which sprang from the mixture of the invaders with the old inhabitants of the empire was generally Christian. Among the Germans on the Rhine Christianity was introduced at an early date. To pass over expressions of ancient writers which are rather rhetorical than exact, churches appear to have existed at the end of the 3rd century at Treves, Metz, and Cologne. Maternus, bishop of Cologne, was one of the commissioners appointed to adjudicate in the matter of the Donatists, and in the following year he appeared at the Council of Arles, where appeared also Agratius, bishop of Treves. The date of the origin of the churches at Tongres, Spires, and Mainz, where Crescentius is said to have been the first bishop, is uncertain, though no doubt ancient. On the Danube, in Noricum, Raetia, and Vindelicia, we have more certain accounts of the first planting of Christianity. Probably it made its way through the Roman garrisons, and it is in places where there were colonies or stationary camps that we first find it. The oldest church in this region is believed to be that of the Lorch, anciently Loracum, where Maximilian the Martyr was bishop. Among the martyrs at the beginning of the 4th century we find Victorinus of Pettau in Styria, and Afra of Augsburg. In Pannonia the seat of a bishop was fixed at Sirmium, an occupier of which, Irenaeus, suffered death in the persecution of Diocletian. These, however, are but scanty gleanings compared with the great harvest which in the course of a few generations was to be brought into the garners of the Church. In the early part of the 3rd century a group of loosely connected tribes which had their habitation between the Vistula and the Danube were known to the Romans as Goths. It was in combat with them that the emperor Decius lost his life. In the days of Valerian and Gallienus hordes of Goths pressed into the empire as far as Asia Minor, where they destroyed many precious monuments of antiquity, among them the famous temple of Diana at Ephesus. After crushing defeats they soon became again formidable, and were a constant cause of dread to the empire, until Constantine made a definite peace with them and enlisted from their number a body of 40,000 under the imperial banners. Peace lasted so long as the family of Constantine was on the throne. During their incursions into the empire the Goths had carried back with them into their own country many Christian captives, including some clergy, by whose means many of the captors became Christians. It would even seem that a regular hierarchy was established in their territory, for a Gothic bishop subscribed the decrees of the Council of Nicaea. But the real founder of Gothic Christianity was one of their own kindred, Ulfilas. Born about 311 in a Christian family which had been carried away captive from Cappadocia into the Gothic territory, he received a name no doubt in familiar use among the Goths. There he grew up under Christian influences, speaking Gothic as his native tongue, but probably acquainted also with Greek. While still among the Goths he seems to have become a reader in the Church, but about the year 340 he was sent by the Gothic king as an ambassador to Constantinople, and was there consecrated bishop of the Goths, probably by prelates of the Arian party, to which he always remained attached. He was present at a council at Constantinople in 360, and assented to the creed then set forth, which was an attempt to set aside altogether the principal technical terms on which the controversy turned, while acknowledging Christ to have been begotten of God the Father, before all ages and before all beginning. The declaration of faith, however, which Ulfilas left behind does not coincide with this, or indeed with any other symbol known to us. In this he says nothing of the eternal generation of the Son, but describes him as "our Lord and God, Creator and Maker of the universe, not having any like him." Whatever were the exact views of Ulfilas, it is beyond question that the Goths among whom he worked with so great success became Arian. When Arianism was dominant in the empire, the pagan chief of the West Goths, Athanaric, became alarmed at the rapid increase of those whom he regarded as the natural allies of their co-religionists in the empire, and began a persecution. Many Goths suffered loss and injury, and even death itself, for their faith. It was probably by Ulfilas that the Arian emperor Constantius was induced to permit the settlement of the Arian Goths on Roman territory. Mingled with their still pagan kindred, they passed in great bands over the Danube into Moesia, and extended their settlements into the foot of the Haemus range. This was the principal scene of Ulfilas' work, but his activity reached also the Goths on the north bank of the Danube, where he had the help and support of other missionaries. The number of his converts alarmed Athanaric, who persecuted those Goths who remained within his dominion, and there were again many martyrs. Fritigern, however, Athanaric's rival, who was anxious to remain for a time in friendship with the Arian emperor Valens, protected the converted Goths and permitted missionary work to go forward unhindered. It was in this period of anxiety and varied fortunes that Ulfilas wrought out the great work which has given him his most enduring title to fame. He gave the Goths the alphabet in which their language was written, and translated the Scriptures from the Greek into the Gothic tongue. The books of Kings he left untranslated, as he thought the accounts of the wars of the Jews only too likely to inflame the warlike passions of the Goths. This translation is a masterpiece of its kind, very faithful to the Greek text, but not following it so closely as to do violence to the Gothic idiom. Ulfilas' work on the northern side of the Danube had continued under Fritigern's protection but a few years, when the Goths were driven from their ancient seat by the Huns, and settled in large numbers in Thrace under the protection of Valens. Not very long after this migration, the hard treatment which they had received from the imperial officials caused war to break out between Goths and Romans, a war in which Ulfilas and the Goths who had crossed the Danube with him at the time of the first persecution decided to take no part. In vain Ulfilas attempted to mediate between Fritigern and Valens. The emperor fell in battle with the Goths at Adrianople, and the victors pressed on, wasting the land with fire and sword, to the Adriatic seaboard and to the very walls of Constantinople. The great Theodosius delivered the empire from its pressing danger, and so anxious was he to unite the Goths with the Church, as well as the empire, that he summoned a council at Constantinople in the year 383, though the Second Ecumenical had but just propounded its creed, which was to attempt to devise articles of union. Ulfilas attended it, but only to find himself branded as a heretic when emperor and council agreed in maintaining unaltered the Constantinopolitan creed. The distress which he must have experienced perhaps hastened his end, for in the same year he died. There were not wanting, however, ardent disciples to carry on his work. The Goths remained Arian, a fact which greatly influenced their subsequent history, inasmuch as it introduced an important difference between them and the Catholic inhabitants of the empire which they overran. The Arian dominion led the latter more and more to look for help to the emperor and the pope. Yet the Goths were for the most part merciful conquerors and sovereigns. The capture of Rome by Alaric, king of the West Goths, sent a shudder throughout the empire. Many thought that the end of the world had come. But the conqueror gave orders to spare the churches, and those who had fled to them for refuge, while the treasures of the cathedral church were openly carried to a place of safety. And when, after his early death, his successor Ataulf married Galla Placidia, the daughter of Theodosius, and shewed himself friendly to the conquered race, even the Romans began to see the promise of a better time. In Spain, the invading Goths brought over to Arianism the Suevi, earlier settlers, who had adopted the Catholic faith which they found there. The Vandals, who had been permitted by Constantine to settle in Pannonia, had there been converted to Arianism by missionaries of the West Goths. But unlike their teachers, who everywhere treated with forbearance the Catholics under their dominion, the Vandals bore a fanatical hatred to the adherents of the Nicene faith, and persecuted them wherever they had the power. In Africa in particular, especially when they were led by King Hunneric, they inflicted all imaginable outrages upon the Catholics and their churches. A conference which Hunneric brought about between orthodox and Arian bishops had no result, except to stimulate the Vandal king to fresh violence. After the death of Hunneric, the persecution continued under his nephews Gundamund and Thrasimund. A milder period followed the death of the latter, but this period was short, for in the year 533 the Vandal power was overthrown by Belisarius, and the African province, weakened and desolated, was restored to the empire. In the middle of the 5th century a large proportion of the Teutonic tribes who were dominant in western Europe belonged to the Arian confession. This state of things was however completely changed by the conversion of the Franks to Catholic Christianity. Chapter 14.